Risk and crisis communication is a critical element of an organisation. A crisis can pose a significant threat to operations that can have negative consequences if not handled properly. This presentation will aim to critically analyse the crisis communication strategies adopted by MAID establishment when faced with a reputational crisis. So just an outline of the crisis which impacted on MAID establishment. In April this year, MAID establishment, founded and directed by MasterChef judge George Calombaris, was faced with an organisational crisis. George Calombaris' restaurants had underpaid staff $2.6 million. Staff were not paid at the correct salaries or overtime due to historically poor processes. The MAID establishment group was first alerted to a problem with their payroll system by the Fair Work in 2015 when there was an issue with one employee's payment. It was later discovered after an internal review that the issue actually impacted over half of their employees. As outlined by Jax, an issue is a trend or development, real or perceived, usually at least partly in the public arena, which, if it continues, could have a significant impact on the organisation's financial position, operations, reputation, or future interests, and requires a structured approach to achieve positive planned outcomes. Issues therefore need to be managed effectively and efficiently to stop them escalating and to reduce the impact on the organisation's reputation. Jax therefore suggests that issues should be managed using a three-step process. The three-step process involves scanning for and identifying potential issues, prioritising which issues to work on, and then finally assigning resources and putting plans in place. So, MAID establishment used this process as suggested by Jax. Soonly after being appointed, the new CEO of MAID establishment, Troy McDonough, became aware that the organisation had been alerted by the FWO to an issue with an employee's payments back in 2015. Identifying that this issue could have a negative impact on the organisation, McDonough conducted an internal review and then asked professional services KPMG to conduct an audit on the organisation's payroll system. The analysis confirmed that a number of team members had been incorrectly paid. This is a great example of how issue scanning and identification can be used to minimise the effects of a potential crisis, as well as having some control over emergent issues. McDonough conducted an internal review in order to scan for emerging issues and has even extended this approach by broadening the review process to involve an external opinion. He has then prioritised this issue as high priority based on its level of impact and the organisation's capacity to influence this issue. Following this, strategic actions took place and crisis communication strategies were implemented. One of the most important steps in strategic and effective crisis management is accurately identifying and prioritising the publics with which you want to communicate with and rebuild relationships. Grunick and Hunt's stakeholder theory is something that is particularly relevant when looking at who to communicate with first when it comes to an organisational crisis. Their theory is based on narrowing down stakeholders, firstly by their attributes and then by their level of involvement in the problem or crisis. Identifying and prioritising stakeholders is something MAID establishment did really well when responding to the payment scandal. True to Grunick and Hunt's stakeholder theory, MAID establishment thoroughly considered stakeholders according to their linkage to the organisation, so enabling functional, normative, diffused, and their level of involvement in the crisis. So what you see here is just an example of a few of the stakeholders that MAID establishment communicated with. So members of the board and important people within the organisation would have been contacted in regards to the emerging crisis, and some type of meeting would have taken place. From here, the organisation have decided to contact the Fair Work Ombudsman They have then emailed current employees outlining the issue using instructive and adaptive information. They have then released a media statement to the public and have also opened up channels of communication via phone, email, website for former employees. Another complication an organisation in crisis will face is the fact that trust is easily destroyed between an organisation and its stakeholders when a crisis or issue occurs. As outlined by Slowly, trust is typically created rather slowly, but it can be destroyed in an instant. Thus, once trust is lost, it may take a long time to rebuild to its former state. Additionally, Coombs' theory also outlines that increased attributions of crisis responsibility generate stronger feelings of anger toward an organisation, while reducing feelings of sympathy. It is therefore vital for organisations to rebuild and gain back trust from its stakeholders. Sturgis suggests that in order to regain trust and reduce feelings of anger, an organisation must first address the physical and psychological concerns of the victims. He argues that management should concern itself with categories of information as a crisis progresses through its life cycle. So, Maid Establishment concerned itself with using two types of information in their communication strategy, and that was instructing information, so that's telling people affected by the crisis how they should physically react, as well as using adjustive information, so information that helps people psychologically cope with the magnitude of the crisis. So when a crisis occurs, it creates a need for information. As highlighted by Coombs, the uncertainty of a crisis produces stress for stakeholders. They therefore need information about what has happened and what is being done to protect them from crisis in the future. Maid Establishment's first priority was that the organisation was providing, instructing and adapting information to the people that needed it. The organisation sent out an email to all current employees informing them what has happened, what is going to be done about the issue, and also expressing empathy and apologies. By providing this information and expressing concern, the organisation was able to reduce the impact of the crisis on their reputation. So crises damage the reputation of an organisation, and such changes can affect how stakeholders interact with the establishment. The crisis communication theory suggested by Coombs can be used to repair and or prevent reputational damage. As outlined in the theory, it is essential that crisis managers should follow a two-step process to assess the reputational threat. The first step involves identifying the initial crisis responsibility. So with the crisis regarding Maid Establishment and underpaid staff, it would be described as a preventable crisis type. That is, regulations have been violated and human error in processes have occurred which have led to this outcome. As outlined by Coombs, the crisis type determines how much stakeholders attribute responsibility for the crisis to the organisation. So this crisis type would suggest that Maid Establishment have a high level of crisis responsibility, and therefore the crisis has a higher chance of damaging the organisation's reputation. Being such a severe reputational threat, it was essential that Maid Establishment utilised a crisis response strategy that accurately reflected the organisation's crisis responsibility. So here is just an example, just a snippet of the email that was sent to staff members. So the Maid Establishment used the rebuild crisis response strategy to protect the organisation and minimise negative reactions to the crisis. In doing so, the organisation has accepted responsibility for the error in processes which led to its employees being underpaid. Not only did the organisation admit wrongdoing to employees and the public, but they were also the ones to notify Fair Work. They expressed empathy and have fully apologised to affected employees. The organisation also offered compensation via repaying staff members at the highest possible rate of overtime. As outlined by Coombs, this is the most effective response, especially when dealing with a crisis with a high responsibility. So, even though Maid Establishment managed this crisis effectively, it would be naive to say that the underpayment scandal hasn't affected their reputation. As emphasised by Coombs, a crisis reflects poorly on an organisation and will damage a reputation to some degree because of the negative information it generates about the organisation. The goal is to use crisis management strategies and communication to reduce this impact on organisational reputation and minimise the damage. And this is something that Maid Establishment did really well. They prioritised and communicated with stakeholders based on their relationship with the company and their involvement in the crisis. They were prepared for the emotional response from stakeholders and used instructive and adapting information to help people cope. And they also effectively identified the crisis type and used an appropriate communication strategy. So whilst this crisis did have a negative impact on the organisation, the crisis and management team effectively used strategies to help minimise the damage on the organisation's reputation. Thank you.